So I'm going to use a PowerPoint so that you guys can have that for notes. I also have some lovely plant friends. I have actually never tried to show plants in my house, but I'm going to try. And if it doesn't work, we'll give you some extra pictures for ID for those of you that aren't familiar with these plants. All right, so this class is on how to use and choose spring lymphatic herbs, and we're going to be talking about 4 herbs in particular today. We're going to do a lightning fast brief overview of the lymphatic system and the 6 tissue states. We're going to look at some signs of lymphatic stagnation and then dive into chatting about the herbs. There'll be plenty of time for questions. Tiffany, our one of our students and our marketing guru, is going to answer any questions on the chat. And she's going to speak if someone needs a question answered before we move on. All right, so what is the lymphatic system? So the lymphatic system is in green on this picture, and it is an extensive network of vessels, nodes, and specialized tissues that pass through almost all of our body. So it's found all over the body, including in the brain. They didn't know that for a long time. So the lymphatic system has quite a few different functions. The ones that we're going to talk about here that kind of pertain to the herbs we're talking about. The lymphatic fluid and extracellular fluid bathe cells in moisture and nutrients. So it's kind of like an aqueduct in that way. They're continuously moistening and feeding the cells and also holding and transporting things that the cells need. It also is a means to transport waste products and other materials away from the cells, so much like a kind of a canal system. And it also cleans, filters, and processes fluids of the body, kind of like a gutter system or a water treatment facility. And because of all of these things, it's a very important part of the immune system. The lymphocytes and carries other types of immune cells throughout the body to kind of protect us. And we don't have time to dive deeply into the immune system, but you will be getting links to some resources to dive more deeply into the immune system. Some of the main parts of the immune system. So we have the vessels. You see here some vessels in pink. And the point of our lymphatic vessels is to transport lymphatic fluid throughout the body. We have lymph nodes. So these filter our lymphatic fluid, and they tag potential pathogens. They clean up byproducts of the destruction of and the byproducts of, kind of killing pathogens. And we have a MALT, which is the mucus-associated lymphoid tissue. So these are small collections of lymphoid tissue, but they are not encapsulated. So nodes are completely encapsulated little things. And these are just patches of tissues, and they're found in mucosal membranes all over the body. Especially we have them in the gut and in the urinary system in high concentrations. We have the spleen, which is a lot like a lymph node, but it filters blood. So it has that same sort of filtering and tagging aspect as a lymph node, but it's blood. There's also the maturation of blood cells that happens in the spleen. And our fluid, so the extracellular fluid is this watery substance that bathes the cells. And this fluid comes from the vascular system, so it leaks out of the vascular systems, and so it contains not only nutrients, but the cellular waste products throughout the body, as well as those immune cells. And excess extracellular fluid is taken up by the lymphatic system, and that's when it becomes lymph. So how does our move? Lymph fluid circulates completely separately, but similarly to the cardiovascular system. Heart pumps blood throughout the body. In the case of the lymphatic system, lymph fluid is moved through the physical movement of our skeletal muscle. It moves through deep intentional breathing. There is a small, teeny tiny amount of skeletal muscle around the lymphatics that will helps to move them. Not much, not like the arteries, though. One-way valves throughout lymph vessels to encourage forward movement. So when lymph vessels are working correctly, fluid can only flow forward. And then even the pulsing of larger arteries near lymphatic vessels will help a little bit with moving fluid. But so the main way that we can affect our nervous or our lymphatic system, I was teaching about the nervous system earlier today, is through the physical movement of our bodies. So stretching, moving, walking, and breathing. So we are going to do, for those of you that aren't familiar with the 6 tissue states, we are going to do a lightning fast overview. This is a topic that you can talk about very quickly, and it seems really, really simple, but know that there's a lot of complexity in the tissue states and how they interact together, and that you're not going to be necessarily just one tissue state. We'll send you a link. Jim McDonald has a really amazing, pretty long document on herbal actions and tissue state energetics. And I suggest that you can purchase that from his site. And if you want to dive really deeply into the 6 tissue state model, that would be the best place to start. I think it's excellent. So our 6 tissue states, we have hot, dry, tense, lax, cold, and moist or damp. So when we think about heat, hot, the tissue state of heat, we're not necessarily thinking about temperature, although sometimes, like in the case of acute inflammation and things like fever, you are going to get the physical feeling of heat. But hot encompasses not only the increase in body temperature, whether overall in the case of a flu or an infection, or locally at the sites of inflammation where we're seeing that redness and swelling, and then new injuries can feel hot to the touch, and also kind of that pain in that area. So we're encompassing that along with increased or over functioning. So it's not necessarily just that temperature. You're often going to see, if you look at someone's tongue, their tongue is going to be red. Their skin can also have a redness or a pinkness to it. Oftentimes it looks ruddy, so kind of an uneven mottled red or pink. You can sometimes see over secretion or over functioning of organs or systems. So this is when we're thinking about something like an acute allergy attack, a bee sting, in the moment that that's happening, when things start to swell. An acute injury, you twist your ankle, it starts to swell and it's red. That's an issue of heat. Fever is an issue of heat. Also, diarrhea is often, especially sort of that acute kind of more explosive or forceful, very liquidy diarrhea is often a matter of heat. And so heat on its own is an increase in function, but what happens a lot like a fire, when you put a pot of water on it, if your body is in a state of heat or over functioning longer, it's going to burn off fluids in the body, and that can cause dryness. So dryness can be caused from heat. It can be caused by insufficient fluids to keep your tissues moist, whether that's from heat, whether that's from not drinking enough water, getting enough healthy fats in. You're often going to see dry, kind of rough skin, hair, and nails. So your nails will often, kind of break easily and be brittle if they're growing at all. You're going to see, you often can see constipation. So constipation in most of the tissue states, but this is constipation from lack of moisture. So the stool will look kind of small and pebbly and and won't be bulked together, almost like rabbit droppings. When someone sticks out their tongue, you're not going to see any moisture on it. And it can even, if folks are super dry, you're even going to see some withering. And what withering looks like is, I thought I had a picture, and nope, I'll send you guys a picture. It just looks like a lot of cracking. And note that when you're looking at folks' tongues, some folks have genetically very cracked tongues, and having a crack down the middle line of your tongue is pretty normal. for some people. And you can also, when you're dry, you're not going to have as many fluids. So maybe your mouth is dry, you're not going to have a lot of saliva, your mucous membranes, you might not be sweating as much as you normally do. We can see dark urine that has a strong smell, and that maybe there's not a lot of it. So scanty urine. See, for folks with vaginas, there's going to be some dryness and possibly some irritation there. Then we have tension. So when we're looking at a tense tissue state, we're looking at things like muscle tension, also things and spasms. So thinking about alternating states, like fever with chills. So there's tension in terms of fever. So let's say that we have a high fever and we're really, our bodies are very tense, then we're not able to move that heat throughout to the surface. And that can alternately cause chills. If we look at someone's tongue, we might, not always, but sometimes, see that when they hold their tongue out, it's quivering slightly. That can be a sign of tension. We often see mental tension, anxiety, irritability, potentially some jaw grinding or jaw clenching at night. And note that magnesium deficiency can also cause most of these symptoms. I would say not necessarily the fever with chills, but the shaky tongue, the mental tension, the muscle tension, and the spasms. So we always want to look at what's going on in the body, but also note, that there might be things causing it that don't have to do with that primary tissue state. So if someone is tense, maybe you'll see their shoulders standing up or like holding their shoulders close to their ears. Maybe someone's arms will be close at their side and they'll look rigid and they'll be moving in more of a kind of a jerky manner. And that can show, physical tension. So when we think about laxity or looseness, much like these very ridiculous basset hounds here with their very loose, lax skin, we can think leaky conditions, right? And so if we have tissues in the body, healthy tissue is going to not be too dry or too wet, but it's going to be able to hold on to moisture. And so if we have something like a drippy nose, so we're not thinking about that acute allergy where you're sneezing and everything is red and your face is red and you're feeling really itchy. We're thinking about that constant little drip that's almost tickly. More of a mild diarrhea or a softer stool that isn't quite liquidy can often be caused by laxity. So that would happen because your digestive tract doesn't have enough tone to hold on to your bowel movements long enough for it to pull some of the water out of your stool. And that can also be caused by a cold tissue state. You're often going to see pale, cool skin in a lax tissue state. Although if tissues are lax because of an acute sort of attack, so when someone has allergies, kind of at the end of that heat, it slows down into a warmth where everything is kind of drippy. And that is also a form of laxity of tissues. It might be more of the beginning stages of laxity, but you might see, instead of a hot redness or that pale coolness with the laxity, you might see kind of a deeper pink or a little bit of purple mixed in. So we also think of sagging tissue all over the body and prolapse. I wrote inconvenience instead of incontinence. So we're thinking of incontinence, uterine prolapse, and things like that. So the lack of ability for tissues to hold on to moisture can also cause dryness and atrophy, which is kind of an extreme dryness, which further exacerbates the issue. So often we need softening with like mineral-rich herbs and demulcents in addition to just drinking water, along with sort of more astringent things to tone up those tissues to take care of laxity. So taking care of the lax tissue state needs a kind of a multi-pronged approach. So we look at coldness, we talked about heat as an increase in function or an overfunctioning. We're looking at coldness as a decrease in function and kind of a reduced metabolic rate in general. So we're thinking sluggish digestion, which can also often show up as protein and fats can feel kind of heavy in the stomach, or like they're just food is just kind of sitting in the stomach. For those of you that see clients, you'll hear words like heavy and sitting, and that people will naturally kind of shy away from heavy proteins and fats, especially animal proteins. Cold pain is of kind of a dull, achy, chronic sort of quality. You're often going to see pale tongue, and the skin is going to be pale. You might see a kind of grayness under the eyes. Note that pale tongue and pale skin can also be a sign of iron deficient anemia, and no amount of warming herbs can treat iron deficient anemia. So we want to be conscious when we're looking at paleness to make sure that folks are getting adequate iron. And then so we can also have constipation in the cold tissue state from lack of digestive function, so that there's very slow digestion, sluggish digestion. The tissues aren't, coordinating to move the food and the stool throughout the body, and maybe we don't have enough digestive juices going, so everything is slowed down. And so we have moist or damp tissue state. Often look like excess fluids in the tissue in general. So we're thinking about kind of swollen, spongy tissues. The tongue can often look puffy. It's going to be often shiny and slick with saliva. And sometimes you can see scalloping in the tongue, which are kind of like waves. It's basically it's indentations from your teeth on your tongue, because your tongue is maybe a little bit puffy and swollen. And this is that we see a lot of lymphatic congestion, which is kind of what we're going to focus on after we're finished with this overview. In the moist or damp tissue state, we see oilier skin, oilier hair, seeing sluggishness, low energy. And note that low energy and fatigue can be caused by a lot of different health issues. It's kind of a complex topic. But if someone is showing all of these other symptoms and they're also a little sluggish, doing something, giving them some, some warming, moving herbs, some aromatics, and some lymphatic support might also help with their energy. So there are a lot of signs and symptoms of lymphatic stagnation. We're going to talk about a few here, and then we'll dive into more specifics as we look at herbs. So we often have fluid retention in the body. We have so that can look like lymphedema. It can even kind of feel like bloating. We're looking at enlarged lymph nodes, and this is really common with infections and with allergies specifically. A stuffy feeling in general in the head and the body, and maybe in the pelvis. So we have a lot of lymph nodes around our jaw and neck, so around our heads, to kind of be protecting our brains. And we also have a lot of lymph nodes in our groin area. And so we can see kind of just that stagnation, that stuffiness, that kind of puffy feeling. And malaise, which I like to describe as the tired yucks. Thomas uses yucks for something else. I can't remember what it is, but just that it's almost like right before you start getting a mild cold. So you're not sick, you don't have a fever, you're just a little run down, you're a little stuffy, icky feeling. If you're getting chronic colds, you might have some lymphatic stagnation. And of course, that could be potentially more complicated, and you might need an immune support in addition to the lymphatic support. But I also want to say, in terms of fluid retention, if someone on their legs, if you can push your fingers into their lymphatic, or into the tissue of their calves, and you see the indentation for more than 2 or 3 seconds, they need to be checked out by their doctors, because they potentially could have an issue going on with their heart. So when we're thinking of fluid retention, we're thinking of that feeling of puffiness in general, but because if it gets so bad that there's pitting, swelling, then it's important to get checked out by a doctor. In terms of lymphatic stagnation, we can also see dull skin, we can kind of sometimes see blemishes and, acne and boils and things can come up. There is a liver component to kind of blemishes and skin things as well, but there is also a lymphatic stagnation component. And also sometimes constipation. So we're thinking about that, that sort of constipation talking about in the damp. So it's not that the stool is dry necessarily, it's that it's kind of stuck in there because there isn't a lot of tone and there's a lot of moisture. So that's thinking about kind of like pastier stool. So lack of lymphatic flow as stagnation as the primary tissue state. But this stagnation can be primary, so it can be caused by this damp, stagnant state as a primary presentation, or it can be caused by secondary stagnation, and that is caused by another tissue state. So in the primary tissue state, we're thinking about that dampness with lack of tone, that bogginess. So we're thinking about a swamp. The water is standing, things are kind of festering around because there isn't enough movement. It's usually not hot, but it's usually not too cold either. It's often after infections, it's a little warm, and after allergies or just lack of movement, it's going to be a little on the colder side. So this is a chart that one of my colleagues, Forrest Tracy Chalmers, created for our lymphatic class a few years ago. And so some of this, we're not going to dive into like all of these things, but I wanted you guys to have this so you can kind of understand how lymphatic congestion can be caused by a lot of different tissue states. So like if we're looking at tension, lymphatic vessels are hollow, or vascular system vessels, and so they blocked by muscle tension. So if our bodies are too physically tense, there isn't going to be the fluid is just not going to be able to move. It can also be blocked by fascial tension in that way and by spasm. When our tissue state is cold or depressed, the lack of blood flow and the lack of movement and the lack of metabolic activity is going to affect the ability for our lymphatic vessels to move things through. In terms of irritation or heat, we're seeing the tissue irritation, we're seeing that redness, and that potentially working towards, so inflammation and irritation is going to cause kind of a backup as all of our fluids and lymph cells and white blood cells come to the area of irritation and the area of inflammation to do the jobs that they need to do. And that can cause stagnation and backup of the lymphatic system, because if there's so much going on in an area of our body, then maybe our lymphatic system can't keep up with it and needs some extra support. So in terms of dryness or atrophy, if we have inadequate hydration, oils, and if our electrolyte balance, so that balance of salts and minerals isn't right, that'll cause the lymph fluid to dry up and become sticky. And so there can be lack of movement through lack of that fluid, lack of actual fluid or the viscosity of the fluid. And in terms of laxity, we have a loss in tone that leads to oftentimes to a retention of lymphatic fluid. In other parts of the body, we're seeing these lax, kind of drippy states, but lymphatic system, we would see retention of fluid around the cells and in the tissues of the body, and kind of a backup in the lymphatic vessels. So why is our lymphatic system more likely to be stagnant after a long winter? And I wrote some things down here, and I'd love for you guys to throw some things into the chat. So what we're kind of thinking about now, we talked about the lymphatic system. We talked a little bit about the tissue states and how the tissue states affect our lymphatic systems. So if we're thinking about heat, dryness, coldness, lack of movement, and laxity and tension, we're thinking about how some of these things present themselves in the context of winter, and why it's so lymphatic herbs historically have been used as spring tonics as they're coming out of the ground. So we're thinking about dryness from heating and from just outside air. Those of us that live in places that are cold enough to freeze most of the winter are going to have an overall dryness in our tissue states that can lead to sort of that stagnation and that kind of sticky sluggishness of fluid. Most, but not all of us, but most of us move our bodies less in the winter. Even if we keep a good exercise routine or a movement routine going, we're not really gardening as much. We're not, cleaning as much. Winter is kind of a time, well, especially for me, winter is a time to kind of move inward a little bit and be a little slower and more thoughtful. So lack of moving our bodies. Being cold can cause tension, and that is really simple. So you're cold and you're tense, that can inhibit the movement of lymph fluid. Oftentimes our lymphatic systems can kind of be overburdened with kind of heat and then laxity from colds and flus and COVID, because those of us that are cooped up and in the winter have an increased amount of exposure to colds, flus, and things like that. So that is causing our lymphatic system to have to work in overdrive to deal with the byproducts of those illnesses as we start to get better. And then in addition to in addition to winter, I think that for folks that have early spring allergies, like tree pollen allergies, you can come into early spring with, the lack of movement and the dryness and maybe some tension, or maybe we're relaxing the tension a little bit because it's finally starting to get warm, and maybe you're not going to get a cold every other week. And then bam, tree pollen hits, or whatever sorts of pollen are going on for you in your area in the springtime. And that can cause kind of an influx of heat and then stagnation as well. I'm going to peek in here some of the comments.
Yeah, Mel, we had a really good question. Would fewer fresh fruits and vegetables contribute to this?
Absolutely. So if we're thinking about dryness, that's a great, put that on here. Dryness, not just from heating and outside air, but from, if we're not eating fresh salads and juice fruits, oftentimes people are eating more canned foods and definitely less fresh foods in the winter time. Something that we can do to counteract that is that kind of natural tendency for soups and stews. So we're eating less watery, fresh foods, but we can add moisture into our winters by having mineral-rich soups and stews, because we need that water, oil, and kind of that minerally saltiness in order to hold on to our moisture. All right. So we are going to look at 4 herbs. The first one is violet. We're going to talk about Viola odorata, but know that there are so many species of violets that you can use locally. It would be too much to talk about them all. So I'm going to stop this so I can try and show folks the one that I got from my yard. Violets are kicking here in St. Louis, Missouri. They're big and juicy and beautiful because we just have the perfect amount of warmth and rain to check that out. Okay, let's see what we got here. Oh, that actually looks pretty good. All right. So here is a violet Viola odorata leaf. So we see that it's glossy, it's heart-shaped, and the edge of the leaf is gently, and this can change depending on the species and even the subspecies. That's what we're looking at. And they're palmately veined, which means the veins start at the base and kind of go out, kind of like palm tree, although these curve in this really, really beautiful way. All right, and then let's see, the flowers are smaller. Let's see if we can get the flowers. Ooh, I've seen people do this on a video before. Hold on, guys. All right, so then we've got this really, really beautiful violet flower. The odorata is often purple, and the subspecies there's a subspecies that's white that can mix. For instance, in my yard, we have this dark purple on one side, and then it goes into this kind of creamy, lighter color purple. And then after that, it gets white. And so they can kind of blend together and have a mixture of white and pink. And those are still considered odorata. I forget the subspecies. I'll write it down for you guys. See, I'm actually going to open the picture back up so that you can look at it quickly. So interesting to show herbs. Okay. So we talked about many species are used. So the flower leaves, they rise directly from long horizontal runners. And they bloom in the springtime. And so this flower is not, this is the flower that we see that we can eat and we can make into syrups and teas and that smells so beautiful is not actually the reproductive part of the flower. Later in the summer, they develop an unopened and self-pollinating closed green flower. And that happens later in the summer. And don't eat those. So the seeds and the roots are strongly emetic, so they will make you puke. It's very unpleasant. I have not done it myself, but I have witnessed. So some fun facts. I am kind of a Shakespeare junkie, especially my city has a free Shakespeare in the Park festival every year. It's amazing. And so I've always really loved that in Hamnet, Ophelia hands out violets to represent her innocence and fragility. I love that, that they use the violets. It used to be used to scent perfumes and oils. And they would, even when they weren't using actual violets, they were trying to replicate the smell of violets. The 1800s, that was really popular. And candied violets were also once popular. It's a very, very labor-intensive process of picking the flowers, pulling off the green sepals, and dipping in boiling sugar quickly and laying flat and opening the flower up before they harden. And then you kind of dust those with really, really fine like castor sugar. I know one of my first teachers, Stephen Yeager, made candied violets for the Oregon Country Fair one year, and that's the only time I've ever seen anyone do it. And they said that it took 8 hours, and it was a very reasonably small box. But if you ever would like to do that, there isn't a specific recipe that I've found, but they were really delicious. So violets taste, the flowers taste sweet. The leaves taste a little salty. It's really, really good for that dry atrophy, atrophy and that stagnation that comes from dryness. It's a demulcent, mineral-rich herb, spring herb. It's great for addressing heat and dryness all throughout the body, but particularly in the lymphatic system and the digestive system. It also works pretty well in the respiratory system when you have that kind of heat, that dry heat. It soothes that heat. It can soften hardnesses. So it's really great for softening hardnesses in the breast specifically, as well as the lymph nodes. And it serves as a gentle remedy for folks who flush easily and kind of struggle with that rigidity in the face of stress. It works really well for swollen mammary glands, as well as those swollen tender lymph nodes. And it works amazingly topically to cool and soothe tissue irritation and inflammation. And you can use that topically as a spit poultice, so you can chew some up and plop it on if you have a bee sting. You can bruise the leaves and flowers and kind of roll that on. You can infuse, and you can also infuse the freshly dried leaves and flowers into oil to use that to soothe. A fellow herbalist of mine that is also a mama loved violet oil, or just a very, very, very strong decoction, infusion of violets for sore nipples during breastfeeding. And historically, it was called a mild laxative, so it does not have active the constituents that we consider laxatives. What I think is going on there is that it can support constipation, like stool and tissues that are hard, that are kind of hard and dry. So not just that dryness, but also that hardness. So a infusion of violets, specifically infusion, is going to be able to help that really mild, dry constipation by going in and softening. I also really like violet for, I don't think I put that down, but if you're collecting nettles in the springtime and the nettle sting just gets a little bit too much for you, you can kind of do that spit poultice or bruise it up and smear it along the stingy parts. And I feel like it helps very quickly to calm that down. I think that violet's physiological actions are mild but pronounced. So this isn't a flashy plant. I mean, it's beautifully flashy, but in terms of its use, it's more of a gentle, nourishing, soothing herb for your body and your tissue. And it works well as an almost nervine. It works well to kind of gently soften those worries and irritated thoughts. So we're thinking like hardness of thought as well as your, hard, swollen, tender lymphatic nodes. Restless mind, very mild anxiety, especially in children. That kind of I really love it mixed with, our kind of standard fever teas for kids and adults. When you have that kind of, I'm fevery, I'm irritated, I know I need to lay down and rest, but I just kind of need to move my body. Along with the kind of yarrow, elder, peppermint classic tea combo. Throw some violet in there to kind of mentally soothe as well. So I'm not going to speak very, very specifically to every preparation because it'll be in your notes, and I want to make sure and get through the other herbs before I go, and without going too late. But I like violet as an infusion more than anything. And violet is a little bit sensitive to kind of heat and temperature. So you want to dry it gently and quickly. So not in direct sun. If you have a dehydrator that can go at the very, very, very lowest setting, that's ideal. If not, dry it somewhere not in direct sunlight and with some circulation, like a fan on light. I like so I prefer the infusion. It also works as a tincture. Thomas does it in 60%. The freshly dried, I like to do it in 40. So basically the least amount of water possible. And so the dose and preparation really depends on what you're doing. But if you want to make violet infusion to kind of support that stagnation that we see in the springtime from kind of the winter, I would say, drink 4 to 8 ounces a few times a day. You can also make a really beautiful syrup from violet flowers that's kind of color changing. And so it'll be this really beautiful purple color and or like pinkish color. And then when you put I see I'm dyslexic with that. So it's this beautiful purplish color, and you can put lemon juice in it and it'll kind of change colors. And we'll send you out, Tiffany's going to send you out a violet syrup recipe along with the notes after class. All right. And so when we think about, what we just talked about with violet leaf, and with the tissue states, we don't have time to have a discussion about necessarily every herb, and this is a really good thing to get in the habit of doing when you're learning new plants, is to say, okay, who would this plant be good for in terms of, we talked about those tissue states. So we're thinking about what sorts of things show up as hardnesses and as heat. And I'd love to hear, a couple. Yep. So we talked about the constipation. That's really great. We talked about that kind of irritated sore nipples can be a really great thing. And, bug bites and stings. And along with the fevers, and I said that I love it as a, in with that kind of classic trio for fevers, I feel like it's, you're also getting that gentle lymphatic action. And we don't want to use strong, pushy lymphatic herbs during sickness. We want to let kind of support our body to, heal itself throughout that process. But violet is so gentle and so softening and cooling that it is completely fine to do the whole time that you're sick to help gently support the processes and the work that your lymphatic system is doing. So I really love it for that. Absolutely, you can use it for mastitis. I mean, you want to be using some other things, some anti-infectives and some stronger lymph movers, but it's absolutely can be a part of a lymphatic protocol. Especially you can, kind of bruise or gently, like dip the leaves in boiling water for just a minute and kind of put it over the breast along with the echinacea and the poke and whatever else you're doing. Absolutely. It was, Gabriel. In traditional literature, it often did talk about softening hardnesses meant that they would also use it for growth. So they called them tumors. We don't know if they're cancers or not, but it's always worth a try if folks are having kind of those harder cysts as well. Reference for which recommendation? I'm sorry, Gabriel.
Just
Okay,
about the infused honey.
Oh,
Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, violet flower, I put leaf, but anyway.
No worries. Yum. I love that. The leaves work good in honey as well. Honey has enough moisture to be able to pull out some demulcency as well. All right, let's jump to cleavers. This is one of my favorite plants. I'm also going to stop sharing and do the bring it in. Here we are. So this is cleavers. It is barely in flower anymore. We're having a really warm spring, and so things are really going to seed that normally aren't at this time. But we can see that this has a whorled leaves, and that it's sticky. So if I don't want to do that on my chest, but you stick it and it stays. So we have these kind of sticky hairs that will stick. See, it'll stick there. So that's pretty great. And the flowers are teeny tiny and white. Let me get you a picture of that. No, not that one. So we're using the above ground parts of cleavers. And it has a taste. It's sweet and minerally. I'm having a tornado warning. I'm really sorry about that noise, but there's nothing that I can do until it stops. Sorry about that. There is a tornado in my area, which is fun. If anyone's from St. Louis, be careful. All right, so there's this sweet, almost vanilla-like taste. And also when cleavers dries, it has a really nice, like kumuni, vanilla-like smell. This tissue, it's really great for heat. So the leaves are whorls. So there's 6 to 8 narrow leaf blades. And when we're talking about leaf blades here. The stem is, they call it weak because they don't stand up very well. So they like to kind of flop on over and stick to each other or to other plants or to, whatever it is that if you're walking by. And the stem is square. Like I said, it was sticky. And then they have these hair-like curved, they call them bristles. And the flowers are teeny tiny, and we will look at them in a minute. And they usually flower from May to August. It's only April here, but like I said, we're having a really warm spring. So one of the common names of cleavers is bedstraw. It used to be dried and used as bedding to stuff mattresses. It has a kind of nice, pleasant smell, and it gets kind of fluffy when it's dried. And the stems used to be fashioned into mats, so kind of in a crisscross weave, and so used to filter fresh milk. And I know that happened in Sweden and other parts of Europe. So it would have that light kind of hint of vanilla along with the milk, which is probably really pleasant. So this is a cooling, very mildly astringent lymphatic herb that gets your fluids flowing while kind of helping with that inflammation and that tonification of the lymphatic system. It's one of the best cooling lymphatics, I think. And it's perfect for that kind of non-infectious lymphatic stagnation that lots of us have in the springtime. Cleavers was the most common traditional spring tonic. And so David Hoffman calls Cleavers the best tonic for the lymphatic system available of our simple, gentle herbs. And so they used to use it for what they used to call bad blood, which really, that doesn't actually, mean the blood. That means like metabolic stagnation, lymphatic stagnation, liver stagnation, metabolic, that sort of like metabolic stagnation in general. And so it's really, really good as a juiced. Or if you don't have a juicer and you have a blender, blend it with a little water and kind of strain out and kind of drink that. You can also freeze the cube. So you can make a bunch of cleaver cubes and put them into your water or your drinks throughout the summer. Because it's cooling and kind of tonifying, it can be really great for that like overheating sort of feeling that happens in the summertime. So it's also a diuretic, so it makes you pee, and it supports the genitourinary tract as well as the lymphatic system. So it'll help you pee. It helps to also, just like it does in the lymphatic system, to kind of tonify that tissue and help with the inflammation along with the soothing and the cooling. And so it's a non-irritating diuretic. The juice is highly diuretic. So if you have someone that has kidney issues that's on restricted fluid, or that just needs to not be peeing a lot, or also folks that are already on really strong diuretics, like folks that maybe are diabetic or they have congestive heart failure, be conscious of the cleavers in small amounts is fine, but drinking like 3 or 4 ounces of the fresh juice might make too much water come out of the body. David Winston also uses it for cystitis, BPH, so benign prostatic hypertrophy, and prostatitis. So those kind of issues of like boggy inflammation in the pelvis. So the Eclectics and Physiomedicalists preferred the infusion, 1 ounce of cleavers to 16 ounces of water. And it was especially used for what they called scrofula, which was swelling of the lymph nodes around the jaw and neck. And usually they were talking about that, using it for tuberculosis, but it's also really good for other types of swelling, especially the boggy hot swelling. So less hardness, and think more boggy, because it's gently drying, gently astringent. So it will help a little bit with that tonification. So we would pick violet if we have hard swollen lymph nodes, maybe, and then choosing cleavers if we have the kind of warmer, softer, boggier lymph nodes. So it works as a tincture. We tincture 1 to 2, 95% alcohol. I prefer it works really well as a tincture. I use it a lot in formulas just to kind of give it a little bit of lymphatic push in those boggy conditions. I love the juice. I especially love to freeze the juice, even more than I like to drink the juice plain, but it's really wonderful tasting. And you can make an infusion. I don't think that cleavers is as wonderful as a dried herb, but you can, if you freshly and use it quickly, I think that it works pretty well. All right, so I think I went over these pretty well. I'm going to stop and peek and see if we've got any questions. Oh, thanks, Lou. It seems to be calming down. Good. On to one of my very, very favorite herbs, ground ivy, glencoma. So this herb is in the mint family. We use the aerial parts. It is has lymphatic support, so it moves lymph. It's aromatic. It's a little bit bitter, and it's really, really great for that sort of damp stagnation. So this is a mint family plant. It has a square stem. It has that sort of bilabiate kind of mint looking flower. And it also roots from each and any stem that touches the ground. So this is, if you plant this, it's going to be everywhere, much like peppermint, or I would say that this is even more spreading in the right place. So ground ivy really likes the edges of woods, the edges of fences, the edges of houses, where they're getting a little bit of sun, but they're shaded most of the time by, you know, by the building. They love that dappled shade where they're just getting a pinch of light. So they will completely take over in that environment, and moist areas especially. And so they have scalloped edges. I'll show you guys in a minute. They're not blooming anywhere, but I went and looked in the very back corner of my yard, and there were just a couple of flowers left. And see, they call these kidney-shaped leaves. They're scalloped edge, and they've got little fuzzy hairs on them. And if they get too much sun, the stems and the leaves can be tinged with purple. So here are the leaves, these beautiful little kidney leaves. These are also palmately veined. So we see that all of the veins of the leaf are coming from the center. And here are the cutie flowers. Let's see. Well, you can see the leaves better than the flowers. And then the stem is square. And the flowers are coming out of the leaf axils here. Yeah. And when you crush it, so you pull it and you crush it, it has kind of a musk mint smell. So it's a little bit similar to what folks call hedge nettle, but it's a little more floral and a little bit less funk than that, but it does have a strong musky smell. So ground ivy is a European transplant. It's found almost all over the world. Before hops became popular in the 6th century, ground ivy was what was used to clarify beer. So folks in Europe in the 13, 14, 1500s were having ground ivy beer. I have never made it, but if anyone does, please let me know how it tastes. It's so much more musky than hops. I think that would be a really interesting flavor. Make sure that when you harvest ground, harvesting it from a reasonably clean place. So this plant can pull heavy metals, and especially it's been studied for lead remediation. So it can pull lead out of the body, and there are some pretty promising, not necessarily studies, but like anecdotal evidence that it can help to pull lead from the human body as well. But because of that, you want to be really conscious. For instance, I am in St. Louis, right on the Mississippi River. We call it the lead belt. So I don't harvest and eat ground ivy that's growing in soils that haven't been amended and taken care of, because I'm worried about the lead content. So this is a cooling, mildly drying, cooling to neutral. So some folks think it's cooling, some folks think it's a little warming. It is aromatic. I think it's a little closer to lemon balm than it is to mints or things that are moving, but it does have that aromatics and kind of that fun conversation starter of, do you think it's warming or do you think it's cooling? And so it has a gentle, diffusive lymphatic moving action. And so what I mean by diffusive is aromatics can break up stagnation by creating movement. And so that kind of musky mint aromatics that ground ivy has can help diffuse and move that boggy kind of dampness. And so I think for ground ivy, instead of the hot boggy, we're thinking of bogginess that's kind of on the cooler side. So kind of a cool, damp, boggy lymphatic situation. And so it'll help break up that stagnation. It also has it has those kind of mint family anti-inflammatory things that it does. Like it's a carminative. It's good for very mild kind of gastric cramps. I haven't seen it work very well for menstrual cramps. Some people swear by it. You can try it, see if it works for you. And it also is, its aromatics can affect the lungs. And some old research shows that it helps with nervous headaches. I haven't seen that used so much in current research, but I will say if there is headaches that have to do with lymphatic stagnation, I think that it can work pretty well. So what I use this for most in my practice is addressing fluid accumulation and congestion, lymphatic stagnation in and around the ears and the lymph nodes in the jaw and specifically. And so it's amazing at folks that have issues with stagnation or fluid accumulation in the ears. I have given this tincture to someone and their ears have popped and then it had like gentle fluid coming out many times. So this, although it's useful as a diffusive lymphatic kind of gentle stimulant and toner, it is specifically really good for that fluid congestion and accumulation around the ears and lymph nodes. It works really well as part of an allergy formula for folks that have chronic allergies, because a lot of the stagnation for those upper respiratory seasonal allergies gets stuck, with that like sticky, stuffy headache and just kind of that icky achiness that creation around your jaw and in your ear can lead to soreness around the base of your neck where your neck meets your shoulders. So it's really amazing for that. I use it mostly as a tincture. It historically was also used as an oil, and I've made the oil and I use it sometimes, but I prefer it as a tincture. You can also put the tincture on the lymph nodes and, in the ear canal and gently kind of rub that in to help. If someone's really stuck, it works well to put it on the inside and the outside. And so I also use this for, just because we're talking about it, it doesn't really have as much to do with the lymphatic system, but it can work really well for tinnitus. So tinnitus, those of you that practice, tinnitus is historically really challenging to treat with herbs. There's some forms of tinnitus that come from structural damage that the herbs are not going to touch. But that kind of noise-induced tinnitus that comes from that stagnation and congestion in the ears, this can work amazingly well. So I got this use from Henriette over in Europe, and she mentioned that she read it in a book by Salmon. So the book came out in 1710. So this is an older use, but a lot of herbalists are using it for that, and it's worth a try. I also think that it works well for some types of vertigo. So if there's that congestion that is happening with vertigo, especially folks that get vertigo from allergies or mast cell disorders that also have a lot of lymphatic stagnation, that's where I would use this. Swimmer's ear, also when there's kind of actual fluid that isn't in your body, but there's still fluid in there, it can be helpful. And so I prefer it as a tincture. It's say 15 to 30 drops a few times a day. You're doing it as a simple. It's also really good freshly dried, and I think works almost as well. 1 tablespoon to 1 ounce of herb in a quart jar. So kind of gentle infusion up to standard kind of clinical infusion. It's going to be very strong tasting if you do 1 ounce of herb into a quart jar. So let it steep for a good while. If you're going to put boiling water on it, close it up so you don't lose the aromatics into the air. Okay. So the last herb that we're going to talk about, and I figure that we're just a couple minutes over, but I'm just going to keep on trucking. This is just our last herb, is chickweed. And my chickweed is not flowering anymore, and it looks a little sad. So although I did harvest some, I'm just going to let you guys look at the pictures. So the Latin is Stellaria media, and Stellaria is from the Latin word that means star, because the flowers look like stars. So you see the petals. So these are actually only 5 petals, but they're so cut in that they actually look like 10 petals. And we see that there are some kind of hairs around the sepals. This is a very cute plant. So it has a sweetness and almost a saltiness, not salty like I put salt on something, but salty in terms of a mineral, like a mineral richness to it. Whoop. I took this picture today on the fence. It is looking a little tired, but it's still good. So this is a sprawling winter, kind of early spring annual. And yeah, we already looked at the picture of the flowers. The leaves are really juicy. They're not quite succulent, but they're succulent-like. They're very, very juicy, especially after rain. And the leaves are alternate. So you can see that the leaves, they grow opposite each other. And there are hairs on alternating side of the stems, which I think is pretty cool. So there aren't hairs on both sides of the stems. So this herb is also indigenous to Europe, and it has spread everywhere. It does this cool thing that one of my old colleagues, Lindsay Feldposh, used to say, sleep of the plants. I don't know where she got that, but basically the leaf and the flowers will kind of turn down and in to protect those flowers in the evening times, and then they'll come back up with the sun. It's called chickweed because chickens love it. All birds love it, especially fowl. So I have never fed chickweed to type of bird that people can house, and they all just gobble it up. So this herb has been eaten as a salad green as a fresh green for centuries all over the world. So this herb is very, very gentle. It's nutritive, so it's full of minerals and nutrients. It's a really, it's like moistening, softening herb. It has emulsancy along with that salty mineraliness. So it can bring a lot of moisture into the body and help the body hold on to moisture. It's really, really amazing and soothing for skin irritation and for mucous membrane irritation. And this is, along with cleavers, this is another herb that is really amazing. It's like a spring greens tonic. And more than I tincture this or make it as an infusion, I mean, I do use that, especially topically. And it can be great as a tea. It's full of minerals. But I love to eat it, to put it into soups and stews, to put it into salads, to make pestos out of it. So making it a spring ritual along with those kind of that cleaver's juice to bring in nutrition and gently kind of move our lymphatic systems and kind of ease that dryness in the springtime. So it was cooling. It's really amazing. It could be really amazing as an eye wash and for all kinds of skin irritation. So anything from bug bites, sunburn, to eczema and psoriasis. And it's really common to make an oil out of freshly dried or wilted chickweed to use with these things. I think it's really amazing as a very strong infusion for that as well. For folks that, clients, or you have the infusion and put that onto your body because you're getting more of the demulcency that way. And so that is basically how I use chickweed. I think that chickweed also historically was used to break down dryness and kind of stagnation in the lymphatic system. And so not necessarily those hardness. So we're thinking about, when we talk about the lymphatic stagnation with the sticky lymphatic fluid. So eating chickweed not only is going to kind of use the minerals, and that demulcency to bring moisture in and to soften everything, but it's going to bring that nutrition into the body as well when you eat it. And just kind of overall have a tonic, supportive action in the body. All right. And so we can do this as a standard infusion. So that's, anywhere from 1 tablespoon to an ounce per 2 cups of water. And you can just kind of drink as much chickweed as you want if you're making a tea, 6, 12 ounces 3 times a day. Freely eat it. It can be applied topically as a salve, oil, or compress as needed. You can also chop it up to poultice or spit poultice if you're like out in the woods and someone's yard and you need it. Yep, and there's how we tincture it. Oh, I'm gonna stop the share. Oh, we still have some folks here. That's really great. How late? Oh, I opened 15 minutes. So that's what I have for you guys. I'm gonna peek over here and see if we've got some more comments. Fennel, we're talking about fennel. You grew chickweed in the house one winter. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I didn't mention that. Chickweed is also really good for moistening up the lungs. It's gonna moisten. It's got that demulcency like a lot of herbs. It just has like a demulcent with a lot more lymphatic action than the average demulcent. Does anyone have any questions before we go? I feel like, so we are going to send you out. I feel like we talked a lot. The goal was to make sure you guys knew these 4 herbs and that you knew for what people to choose them for. So that feels like it happened. What oils do you recommend mixing with chickweed? It depends on my goal. I usually do grape seed oil or a mixture of grape seed oil and jojoba oil if I'm doing, topical things. Sometimes I'll use safflower oil if there's going to be like a very inflammatory condition, like really angry eczema. So yeah, it kind of depends. But a mix of grape seed oil and jojoba works well. Yeah, sesame oil is nice too. I don't work with it a lot, but I do work with it sometimes. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining. Sorry I went over. I don't talk as much as Thomas, but I talk a lot too. So an hour is a really hard amount of time to keep oneself to. So thanks for hanging in there, and let us know if you have any questions. And we're going to send you some links to the medicine making class if you're interested, some info on the foundational program, and then you'll get a couple recipes and the notes that you saw that I went through. Bye, everybody. Have a great evening.